Close your eyes and imagine it's the year 1347. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, wet hay, and something else less pleasant. You've just entered the home of a sick man. He's pale, shivering, and covered in blotchy bruises. A physician leans over him, wearing a long robe and a hat that makes him look more like a wizard than a doctor. In his hand? A wriggling leech. Yes, a leech. And this was medicine. You see, for most of human history, people didn't understand disease the way we do now. Germs? Bacteria? Viruses? Those were concepts far, far in the future. Instead, health was thought to depend on something called the four humours. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. A balance between them meant health. An imbalance? That meant sickness. So, what do you do when someone has too much blood? You take it out. And that's where our slippery little friends come in. Doctors in the Middle Ages were obsessed with bloodletting. The idea was simple, if horrifying. If your body was out of balance, if you had a fever, a headache, or just seemed a little too hot, then surely you had too much blood. To fix this, physicians would drain it. Sometimes with a knife. Sometimes with cups and suction. And often with leeches. They'd place leeches on your temples, your arms, your ankles, even your eyeballs. Yes, eyeballs. The leeches would latch on, bite into your skin with their tiny jaws, and suck your blood. For hours. And the doctor would smile and say, "Excellent. You're being purified." Now, let's not be too quick to laugh. This wasn't done out of cruelty or ignorance. Well, not entirely. For them, it made sense. Their entire understanding of the human body came from ancient Greek and Roman texts. From physicians like Hippocrates, who lived more than 1,000 years earlier. And Galen, whose writings became sacred medical scripture. So when medieval doctors read that too much blood caused fever, or that melancholy came from black bile, they believed it. Deeply. Hospitals at the time weren't places of high-tech healing. They were more like monasteries, filled with religious devotion, quiet prayers, and leeches. Rows of beds, candles flickering, monks tending to the sick with chants and warm broth. And if someone coughed up blood? Well, more bleeding might be just what they needed. Of course, not everyone could afford a doctor. But luckily, barbers could help. Yes, barbers. In fact, the classic red and white barber pole comes from this era. Red for blood. White for bandages. Barber surgeons would cut your hair, pull your teeth, and yes, bleed you. They'd sharpen their razors, strap you to a chair, and open a vein like it was just another part of your grooming routine. Feeling faint yet? But leeches weren't just medical tools. They were business. Doctors would travel with jars full of them, stored in cool, damp cloth. A good leech could be reused dozens of times, just let it digest, and it's ready to go again. And in cities like Paris or London, leech markets existed. Yes, markets. People sold them, traded them, even farmed them in marshes. Entire livelihoods revolved around these little bloodsuckers. And no one found it odd. So, was it effective? In some cases, maybe. Leeches release an enzyme called hirudin, which thins the blood. That can reduce clotting, improve circulation, and even relieve swelling. In rare cases, leeches might have helped. But more often, people just got weaker. They'd be bled again and again, until they couldn't stand. Fainting was common. Death? Not unheard of. Still, for centuries, bloodletting was the gold standard. Even into the 1800s, people still trusted it. Even George Washington was bled 4 times in a single day, just before he died. Coincidence? Perhaps not. But here's the strange part. Leeches never fully disappeared. In fact, they are still used today. In modern surgery, leeches help improve blood flow in delicate operations, like reattaching fingers or ears. Their enzymes are incredibly useful in the right hands. So maybe those medieval doctors weren't entirely wrong. Just very, very messy. Of course, not everyone could afford a doctor. But luckily, barbers could help. Yes. Barbers. In fact, the classic red and white barber pole? It comes from this era. Red for blood. White for bandages. Barber surgeons would cut your hair, pull your teeth, and yes, bleed you. They'd sharpen their razors, strap you to a chair, and open a vein like it was just another part of your grooming routine. Feeling faint yet? But leeches weren't just medical tools. They were business. Doctors traveled with jars full of them, stored in cool, damp cloth. A good leech could be reused dozens of times. Just let it digest, and it's ready to go again. And in cities like Paris or London, leech markets existed. Yes, markets. People sold them, traded them, even farmed them in marshes. Entire livelihoods revolved around these little bloodsuckers. And no one found it odd. So, was it effective? In some cases, maybe. Leeches release an enzyme called hirudin. It thins the blood, reduces clotting, improves circulation, even relieves swelling. In rare cases, leeches might have helped. But more often, people just got weaker. They'd be bled again and again, until they couldn't stand. Fainting was common. Death? Not unheard of. Still, for centuries, bloodletting was the gold standard. Even into the 1800s, people still trusted it. Even George Washington was bled 4 times in a single day, just before he died. Coincidence? Perhaps not. But here's the strange part. Leeches never fully disappeared. In fact, they're still used today. In modern surgery, leeches help improve blood flow in delicate operations, like reattaching fingers or ears. Their enzymes are incredibly useful in the right hands. So maybe those medieval doctors weren't entirely wrong. Just very, very messy. Imagine you've got a headache. It won't go away. You feel dizzy, tired, maybe a little feverish. Today, you'd probably grab some water, take a painkiller, maybe lie down. In the 14th century, your doctor might consult the stars. Yes. Before even touching your body, a learned physician might pull out an astrological chart and check which planet was in which house. Was Mars in retrograde? Was Saturn crossing into Cancer? These mattered deeply. Why? Because medieval medicine wasn't based on science. It was based on balance. And the idea of balance came from the 4 humors. The theory of the 4 humors dated back to ancient Greece, particularly to Hippocrates and Galen. But it lived on and thrived in medieval Europe. According to this theory, your health, personality, mood, and fate were all controlled by four bodily fluids. Blood, warm and moist. Associated with optimism, cheerfulness, and energy. Phlegm, cold and wet. Linked to calmness, laziness, and apathy. Black bile, cold and dry. Thought to cause melancholy or depression. Yellow bile, hot and dry. Believed to trigger anger, aggression, and fevers. Everyone had all four, but in different proportions. If they got out of balance, you got sick. Too much blood? You'd be too hot, maybe feverish, or too excitable. So, time to bleed you. Too much black bile? That meant sadness or digestive trouble. A purge. A laxative. Maybe some dried herbs. And if you had too much yellow bile, well, get ready for vomiting. Phlegm? No one liked dealing with that one. So, how did medieval doctors determine which humor was out of balance? They looked at your urine. No, really. Urine diagnosis was a serious practice. Entire books were written on it. Doctors would examine its color, smell, thickness, and even taste. A golden yellow stream might mean health. But if it was too pale? Too thick? Cloudy with foam? That was a sign your humors were misbehaving. In fact, doctors often carried urine charts, like color wheels, to compare samples. Some carried glass flasks specifically designed to swirl and inspect pee under sunlight. And if they didn't have access to your body, they'd diagnose you by examining only your urine, sometimes sent by courier in sealed pots. Yes, there were people paid to carry urine jars across cities. Imagine being a medieval mailman with that job. Still, astrology played a major role too. If you were born under Mars, you might be more prone to fevers or violence. Under Saturn? Melancholy. Under the Moon? Perhaps watery diseases or madness. Some doctors wouldn't perform a procedure, even something as minor as lancing a boil, unless the stars were properly aligned. Surgery during a lunar eclipse? Unthinkable. And if you were bleeding on a Tuesday? Bad news. That was Mars's day, the god of war and blood. Not ideal. But beyond all this, medicine was also spiritual. Sickness wasn't just physical. It was often seen as moral or divine punishment. If you were ill, maybe it was because of your sins. Or maybe you'd been cursed. Confession, repentance, and even pilgrimages were considered treatments. A journey to a saint's shrine or drinking holy water might be prescribed alongside herbal poultices and leeches. And if things got really bad, you might be advised to wear a charm. These were not decorative. They were considered powerful medical tools. Some were inscribed with Latin prayers. Others were tiny metal or wax figures of saints. Many were worn around the neck or sewn into clothing. A popular remedy for epilepsy? Carrying a piece of a hangman's rope. Yes. The rope used to hang a man, thought to have powerful properties, especially if freshly cut. Another common charm for illness, wearing the tooth of a wolf. Or a splinter from the true cross. Or a dried toad, stitched into a pouch. If all else failed, you could be exorcised. Yes, some thought disease was caused by demons, so a priest might be called to pray the illness away. Of course, most ordinary people didn't have access to university-trained doctors. Their medicine came from wise women, midwives, herbalists, and local healers. And they were often surprisingly effective, at least compared to bloodletting and astrology. Garlic for infection. Honey for wounds. chamomile for anxiety, willow bark, which contains a natural form of aspirin, for pain. But these women were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they cured something a priest couldn't. So being too good at healing could get you killed. It was a strange time, when you could be diagnosed by the color of your pee, bled for a headache, and treated with prayers, leeches, and moon charts, and still be told it was all your fault. But somehow, people survived. They endured. And every now and then, something even worked. Not because they understood the body, but because trial and error, over centuries, slowly chipped away at superstition. Even if it meant swallowing crushed emeralds or rubbing goose fat on your chest. Welcome to medicine, medieval style. Or why you never wanted to get hurt in the Middle Ages. So, let's say you were a knight. You're out on the battlefield, galloping full speed into chaos. Swords clashing. Arrows flying. People screaming in Latin, French, maybe even Old Norse. And then, it hits you. A mace smashes your leg. You drop. Pain sears through your body. Your armor's twisted. Blood's gushing. You're alive, but barely. Now what? Well, welcome to medieval surgery. A practice as brutal as it sounds. Let's be clear. There was no anesthesia. No ether. No chloroform. Not even alcohol strong enough to dull the agony. You stayed awake for everything. What did you get instead? Maybe a stick to bite. Maybe a few friends to hold you down. Maybe a quick prayer, if there was time. As for sterilization, the concept didn't exist. Surgical tools were often reused, unwashed. Bone saws, knives, forceps, cautery irons, all used from one patient to another. No gloves. No hand washing. Blood crusted on the instruments was considered normal. The result? Even simple surgeries could turn deadly from infection. But still, surgery happened. Sometimes, it was your only hope. Let's say your leg was crushed or infected. There was one option: cut it off. The surgeon, likely a barber surgeon, would prep his saw. You'd be strapped down or held in place. Then, he'd go in. Fast. The goal was speed over precision. The best surgeons could remove a limb in under a minute. First, they'd slice through the skin and muscle. Then came the sawing, a screeching, grinding sound as steel hit bone. If you were lucky, you'd pass out from the pain. Once the limb was off, bleeding had to be stopped. There were two methods. Cautery, pressing a red-hot iron to the open stump, burning flesh to seal arteries. The smell? Unforgettable. Ligation, tying off blood vessels with thread. A more advanced technique, but harder to pull off on a screaming, thrashing patient. Post-op care? Minimal. Wound dressings were often soaked in wine, vinegar, or honey, not to clean the wound, but to keep the smell down. Infection was almost inevitable. Still, some survived. And if they did, they often became living legends. Medieval battles weren't just violent, they were messy. Blades didn't always kill cleanly. Instead, they broke bones, severed tendons, left people crawling through mud, blood, and manure. Medics, if you can call them that, worked in field tents or monastery infirmaries. They had little to work with. Cloth bandages, herbal salves, maybe a few iron tools. Bleeding was constant. Infection was everywhere. And time was running out, always. The goal wasn't to heal perfectly. It was to save your life, or at least your soul. Priests often stood beside surgeons, giving last rites during the operation. Some patients died mid-surgery, confessing their sins as the saw cut through bone. Sometimes, that was the plan, or arrows were among the most terrifying battlefield injuries. Not just because they pierced deep, but because pulling them out was extremely dangerous. You couldn't just yank them. Barbed arrows tore flesh on the way in and on the way out. Surgeons sometimes had to push them through, slicing muscle and tissue to get behind the arrowhead, then pulling it backwards to minimize damage. Tools called arrow drawers were invented, long, tweezer-like forceps designed to grip and pull without ripping the body apart. Sometimes, the arrow couldn't be reached. In that case, it stayed inside you, and either you lived, or you didn't. Got a head injury. You might need your skull opened. Trepanation, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, was practiced in medieval Europe for everything from trauma to seizures. The idea? Release pressure. Let the bad humors out. Or, more spiritually, let demons escape. Surprisingly, some patients survived. Archaeological evidence shows bone healing around old trepanation holes, meaning people lived through the procedure. And with no anesthesia, no antibiotics, and no understanding of bacteria. That's a miracle. Or madness.so, how did people survive the pain? They didn't always. But medieval doctors did use herbal anesthetics, some of which were surprisingly effective. Common painkillers included mandrake root, a hallucinogenic sedative, used with caution. Henbane, narcotic, but toxic in high doses. Opium poppies, yes, opium was known. Used in mixtures like dwale. Alcohol, strong wine or distilled spirits, used more to knock you out than relieve pain. Dwale was the medieval version of anesthesia. A mix of hemlock, bile, vinegar, lettuce juice, opium, and sometimes gall from a pig. It could make you unconscious. Or it could kill you. It was a gamble. But then again, so was surgery. We often assume medieval medicine was pure butchery. And yes, there was a lot of butchery. But surgeons learned. They passed down knowledge. They developed tools, techniques, and even early forms of prosthetics. Some survived amputations and lived long lives. Some soldiers returned from battle, wounded but proud. And some barber surgeons, as crude as they were, kept their patients alive against all odds. Because even in the darkest times, people still tried to heal. Even if it meant sawing your leg off with a rusty blade, holding you down with 4 men, and praying the leeches worked. Let's begin with a number. 200 million. That's the estimated death toll from the Black Death. Not thousands. Not millions. Hundreds of millions. One of the most catastrophic events in human history. And when it arrived in Europe in 1347, no one was ready. The plague began in Central Asia, probably somewhere around the steppes of modern-day Kyrgyzstan. It traveled slowly, creeping westward, hitching a ride with fleas on rats, and rats on ships. Those ships sailed into Sicilian ports in the fall of 1347. And from there it spread like wildfire. Messina, Genoa, Marseille, then inland, Florence, Paris, London. By 1353, it had reached every corner of Europe. And it changed everything. The Black Death wasn't one single disease. It was likely a combination of 3 forms of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium. Bubonic plague, swollen, painful lymph nodes, called buboes, fever, vomiting, Pneumonic plague, spread by coughing, attacked the lungs, killed in 1 to 3 days. Septicemic plague, got into the bloodstream, turned skin black, almost always fatal. Each form was terrifying. Together, they were unstoppable. First came the fever, then chills, nausea, delirium, black spots, buboes, large swellings, hot and purple, often in the groin or under the arms. People could go from healthy to dead in 48 hours. Nothing made sense. No one could explain it. Doctors were powerless. Priests were overwhelmed. And the people? Terrified. Picture this. A town wakes up to find half its population dead. There aren't enough coffins. Graveyards overflow. Corpses lie in the streets, rotting. Survivors flee, abandoning homes, families, entire cities. Fields go unharvested. Shops close. Governments vanish. Whole villages disappeared. No one left alive to bury the dead. In some places, dogs and pigs fed on uncollected bodies. In others, people barricaded themselves indoors, hoping to outlast the storm. Spoiler, most didn't. Doctors had no idea what caused the plague. They blamed bad air, miasma, or astrological alignments, or divine punishment. Cures ranged from the absurd to the deadly. Burning aromatic herbs, bleeding patients to balance humors, placing frogs, onions, or crushed emeralds on buboes. Drinking mercury, yes, really. Nothing worked. You've seen the outfit. Long black cloak, wide-brimmed hat, and the beaked mask, stuffed with herbs to filter the air. Plague doctors were often not real doctors. Just brave, or desperate, men hired to count bodies and write death reports. They walked city streets like grim reapers in disguise. And often, they died too. When answers failed, people looked for someone to blame. Jews were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells. Thousands were burned alive or massacred across Europe. In other places, beggars, lepers, and the mentally ill were killed. Fear made people violent. Some didn't blame others. They blamed themselves. Enter the flagellants. Religious fanatics who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in the streets. They believed the plague was God's punishment. So they punished themselves. They sang hymns, beat themselves bloody, slept outside, refused baths, preached fire and brimstone in every village they entered. The church wasn't a fan. But the people? Terrified and desperate, they often joined in. Yes. Strangely, some people were immune. Their genetics, blood type, or just sheer luck allowed them to avoid infection. Entire families died, and a lone child lived. Or one servant out of 30. Others survived because they ran, far from cities, into isolated cottages or mountains. Monks who closed monastery gates and never reopened them sometimes made it out. Nobles who sealed their castles tight. Fishermen on islands. They returned to find their world gone. After the Black Death, Europe was forever changed. With so many dead, labor was scarce, and peasants suddenly had bargaining power. Serfdom began to crumble. Wages rose. Land became available. It was the birth of the modern working class. Also, people began questioning everything. If priests couldn't stop the plague, if doctors failed, if governments fled, what else were they wrong about? It sowed the seeds of Renaissance thinking. A slow shift away from blind faith toward observation, science, and humanism. The Black Death shattered the old world. And in the rubble, a new one began to grow. Close your eyes. You're in a village square. You've been accused of theft, or adultery, or witchcraft. There's no lawyer, no jury, no cameras, no evidence. Only a priest, a crowd, a judge, and one terrifying phrase: "We shall let God decide." And with that, your fate was sealed. In early medieval Europe, people believed that God would actively intervene to protect the innocent. So instead of proving your innocence with facts, you'd prove it with pain. This was a justice by ordeal, a legal system where survival meant you were probably telling the truth. And dying? Well, maybe you were guilty after all. Sound fair? You'd be handed a red-hot iron rod. You had to carry it 3 paces. Maybe more. Then your hand would be wrapped in cloth for 3 days. If the wound healed cleanly, God had spared you. But if it festered, turned black, smelled like death, you were guilty. Punishment followed. Often immediately. Another favorite. You'd plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a ring. Same rules applied, wait 3 days. If your skin wasn't bubbling off your bones, you were free to go. If it looked infected, time to bring out the stocks, or worse. Strangely, floating meant you were guilty. This one was used often against suspected witches. The accused was tied up and tossed into a river. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. If they floated, they were guilty. Cue the execution. Yes, this was an actual, legal procedure. Prefer something more hands-on? Then trial by combat was your arena. This wasn't just knights in shining armor. Peasants, widows, priests. Everyone could technically demand trial by combat, or be forced into one. You and your accuser would fight to the death. Victory proved righteousness. Defeat? Well, the guilty rarely got up again. Sometimes champions were hired, men who made a living by fighting for others in court. They were part lawyer, part sword for hire. These weren't fringe cases. Trial by ordeal was official church policy in much of Europe until 1215, when the Pope finally banned priests from blessing the ordeals. But even then, trial by combat continued for centuries. One of the last legal duels in France took place in 1386, between a knight named Jean de Carouges and his wife's accused rapist. It was brutal. 1-on-1, full armor, axes and daggers. Carouges won. Barely. The accused was killed. And the wife? Vindicated, barely escaping death herself, had her husband lost. And in England? Trial by combat wasn't officially abolished until 1819. Yes, 1819.to modern eyes, it feels like madness. But to the medieval mind, God was watching. And the idea of randomness, of pure chance, wasn't part of the equation. If you burned, drowned, or bled out, you must have deserved it. People believed this deeply, and they let it shape their courts, their punishments, even their politics. Some savvy people manipulated the system. Judges could interpret results however they wanted. A minor burn might be called clean. A successful duel could still end with both parties punished. And trial by combat? Sometimes it was used to scare the accused into confessing before the fight even began. In other words, it was also a tool. A terrifying, bloody negotiation tactic. Modern justice isn't perfect. But we've, mostly, replaced swords and boiling water with courts, evidence, and appeals. Still, echoes of trial by ordeal remain, in public opinion, media trials, and even the instinct to prove innocence through suffering. The Middle Ages remind us, justice isn't just about truth. It's about power, belief, and who controls the story. Close your eyes again. You're underground. The air is wet. Thick. It stinks of rot and rust. Somewhere you hear a distant drip. Chains rattle. Rats hiss in the corners. You've just been imprisoned. But not like in modern prisons, with uniforms, food schedules, or parole boards. No. This is medieval punishment. And you're about to learn that jail wasn't the sentence. Jail was the waiting room for something worse. Forget movie cliches, dark stone rooms with flaming torches and skeletons in chains. Those weren't all that far off. Most medieval dungeons were makeshift. Converted wine cellars, castle basements, even dry wells became holding pits for the accused, the condemned, or the forgotten. Ventilation was rare. Light was a luxury. And the stench? Imagine weeks of bodily waste, blood, mold, and the decay of prisoners long gone. Here's the strange truth: in the early medieval world, people weren't punished by imprisonment. Why? Because jails were expensive. Guards had to be paid. Food had to be provided. Cells had to be maintained. So if someone was guilty, they were punished quickly, through fines, whippings, public humiliation, mutilation, or execution. Prison was just a temporary stop, while the authorities decided what to do with you. Think of it as medieval pre-trial detention. Except dirtier. And louder. That depended on the crime. You might be awaiting a trial by combat, awaiting a public execution, awaiting a ransom if you were a noble, awaiting torture because someone thought you were hiding the truth. And sometimes, you waited for nothing. Some prisoners were simply forgotten. No paperwork. No release. Just slow starvation, illness, or madness. In certain castles, archaeologists have found rooms sealed from the outside with only a hole in the ceiling for dropping in prisoners and occasionally food. They weren't designed to be entered again. It wasn't until the late Middle Ages and the early modern era that jailing someone became the punishment. This was due to growing cities, legal reform, and, ironically, a desire to be more civilized. So instead of whipping thieves in the square, authorities started locking them away. But even then, prisons weren't designed for rehabilitation. They were meant to break you. To isolate, humiliate, and slowly erase your will. One of the most disturbing uses of prison? Owing money. If you couldn't pay your debts, say, for rent, food, or borrowed coins, you could be jailed until you did. Yes. You were locked away with no way to earn money until someone paid on your behalf. Families often sold property, children, or themselves to buy someone's freedom. The poor were trapped. Some medieval prisons were infamous. None more so than the Tower of London, where political prisoners, royals, and traitors were kept in grim luxury. Anne Boleyn waited there before her execution. So did Sir Thomas More. Torture chambers. Secret deaths. Ghost stories. It was more than a prison. Guards were often poorly paid. Some were corrupt. Others sympathetic. In many cases, prisoners had to pay for their own food, bedding, or better cells. If you had coin, prison could be survivable. If not, prepare for darkness, filth, and hunger. And yes, rats were real. They came for the crumbs, the mold, and sometimes, worse. It was a message to anyone who dared challenge power. The rich often walked free. Some prisons became profitable. Run by private jailers, these early entrepreneurs charged fees for entry, meals, clean water, chains removal. Even visitors couldn't pay. You got the worst cell, worst food, and maybe no food at all. Freedom had a price. We like to think we've moved on. But some truths remain. Prisons still punish the poor harder than the rich. Jail can still be a pre-sentence, not the sentence itself. And we still argue, should punishment hurt or heal? In the Middle Ages, a jail sentence wasn't about justice. It was about power. About reminding you that the system didn't need you alive. Just obedient. Imagine a quiet town square at dawn. Smoke curls above cold cobblestones. A crowd is already gathering, murmuring. Children cling to their mothers' skirts. Vendors sell bread. Priests offer blessings. And in the center? A platform. A rope. An axe. Or a stake. This was medieval punishment. Not behind closed doors. Not whispered about. It was a spectacle. And it wasn't designed just to end lives. It was designed to shape behavior. Today, punishment is hidden, courtrooms, sealed documents, prison walls. Back then, it was public. On purpose. Executions were like sermons made of blood. Each one told a story. Obey. Confess. Conform. Or else. It didn't matter if you were a thief, a heretic, or a rebel, there was a method made just for you. The rack was simple and horrifying. You were tied at the wrists and ankles. Slowly, wheels turned, pulling your limbs in opposite directions. Ligaments tore. Joints dislocated. Sometimes bones cracked open. The goal wasn't always death. It was confession. A name. A plan. A lie, if necessary. Because medieval courts believed truth lived in pain. If you screamed loud enough, maybe that meant you were hiding something. Some devices are legendary, like the Iron Maiden. But many weren't real medieval tools. They were later inventions, meant to shock or entertain. What was real? The strapado, where you're hoisted by the arms and dropped violently, dislocating shoulders. The breast ripper, used on women accused of adultery or blasphemy. The pair of anguish, a metal device inserted into the mouth, or worse, then slowly opened. They were made for fear. And they worked. Being burned alive was saved for the worst of the worst. Or rather, those seen as threats to power. Witches. Heretics. Rebels. It was slow. It was theatrical. Wood was stacked carefully, dry near the body, wet underneath, to prolong the agony. Executioners were sometimes ordered to strangle victims before the fire reached them, but not always. Crowds watched in silence. Or in cheers. And when the flames were done, the ashes were scattered to erase you completely. Hanging might sound merciful, but in medieval times, it often wasn't instant. The drop wasn't long enough to break the neck. So the condemned would kick, twist, and choke for minutes. Sometimes, friends in the crowd would grab their legs to speed up death out of pity. Other times, they'd let them suffer. Beheading was cleaner, if the executioner was skilled. But if not, you might take 3, 4, even 5 blows before your head finally left your body. Anne Boleyn famously asked to be executed with a sword instead of an axe. She wanted it done in one strike. Can you blame her? Some punishments blurred the line between law and cruelty. Boiling alive. Being sewn into a sack with animals. Drawn and quartered, hanged until near death, then disemboweled, beheaded, and cut into 4 pieces. This wasn't just about law. It was about domination. Kings, popes, and judges wanted the public to know. Your body is not your own. Your life is borrowed. And they could collect the debt at any time. Interrogation by torture wasn't just allowed. It was codified into law in many kingdoms, especially during inquisitions. Accused heretics were tortured until they confessed, even if they were innocent, even if they were children. And once they did, they were often executed anyway. You'd think people would resist, but most were terrified into silence. That was the point, surprisingly, yes. Some laws tried to set boundaries. Torture couldn't cause death, in theory. Priests were usually exempt. Nobles were tortured less often, or in more dignified ways. But in practice, these rules were easy to bend, or ignore entirely. Justice was what those in power said it was. And pain was their language. So, what changed? Over time, executions became less public. Torture was outlawed, on paper. Prisons replaced platforms. But the impulse? It didn't vanish. We still debate how justice should feel. Painful? Swift? Humiliating? Or rehabilitating? Because somewhere deep inside, humanity still wonders. If someone breaks the rules, should they suffer? The Middle Ages had their answer. What's ours?